Welcome to our second talk on the book The Way of Perfection of St. Teresa of Avila. Last week we had the first talk on chapters 1 to 15, in which Teresa talked about the context in which the life of prayer takes place, or which the act of prayer takes place, and she singled out those three essential virtues of detachment, humility, and love for each other. So in the next part, what we're going to do today, she focuses on prayer, and we're going to do the section on prayer, and we'll leave until next week her commentary on the Lord's Prayer, which will lead us into the conclusion of the book. So today we're going to have half an hour on the book Way of Perfection, and in the second part of today's talk we'll talk about St. Teresa watering a garden, which is an image she uses in her autobiography to talk about how we grow in prayer. So you have a sheet in front of you, and for those who are watching, I understand that the sheets will be put on the parish website as well. You don't need to have the sheet to listen. Anything I want to say from the sheet I will read, but the sheet is more for afterwards so that you can recall what has taken place and perhaps get to know Teresa a bit better. So what we've got 10 points that we want to look at today. And the first thing is that the life of prayer is for all. She makes that very clear. It's not just for the Carmelite sisters that she's writing about. She says that if you take the words of the Lord, come to me all those who labour and are burdened, he didn't say, come to me all those who are labour and burdened, I'll help some of you and not the rest. No, it was a general invitation. So she sees the life of prayer as open to all. I think in the past we may have seen the life of prayer a bit more in terms of religious life or clergy. But the Church has made it very clear in the Vatican Council that the life of prayer is for all. And I think the second point that's there on the sheet is that prayer is a way of life. I think we need to distinguish the act of prayer, the various acts of prayer, the things that we do, and the life of prayer. In other words, the life of prayer is a relationship that we have with Jesus. We talk about marriage as two people entering into a common life. Well, the life of prayer is us entering into a common life with Jesus. Now, within that act, that life with Jesus, we have individual acts of prayer. But the important thing is that it's the relationship. That's the end product of all the individual acts of prayer that we have. It's not just enough to say, I'm an expert at this type of prayer. That's just an instrument to bring you to union with Jesus. And that's what holiness is. Holiness is our relationship with Jesus. That's the goal. So when she talks about prayer, she's saying what I call prayer with a capital P, meaning a relationship, a way of life. And the other prayer is prayer with a small p, the particular acts of prayer in which we actually engage, the purpose of which is to bring us to that deeper relationship with the Lord. I like to suggest that the life of prayer is a prayer of the heart. In other words, marriage is a prayer of the heart, a common life of the heart. And prayer is ourselves uniting with Jesus. She makes another point there, and she emphasises that the Lord is within. That basically we can turn to the Lord. She talks about the life of prayer in terms of companionship, a companionship with Jesus. And when she defines what this companionship is all about, she talks about the fact that we can turn within and that we should turn within. The Lord is within and we should be there with him. That's the message that she gives to her sisters. And the point being made is that we can easily turn within and we can become conscious of the Lord just by looking within our own heart. In our teaching of the Church is that the Lord is within. And in our history, it's the movement to go within that is the way to develop our journey to God. St. Augustine, when he came to conversion, he said, late have I loved you, I was in the world outside myself, and you were within. So it's when he turned within that he began to recognize the relationship with Jesus. That was the important thing. The way to go within is what we call recollection. In Teresa's time, recollection was a very big theme. Teresa herself, for 20 years, as I mentioned last week, didn't have a very good life of prayer, but she grew in prayer when she read a book that focused on recollection. And recollection is simply remembering Jesus. In other words, if I was to ask you now to think about somebody you love, well, you put all the other things out of your mind and focus on the person that you love. And she's saying that that's what we need to do. To be recollected, we just need to take time and put other things aside and just to be aware of Jesus in our heart. She makes a good point, and I think it needs to be stressed, that the presence of Jesus doesn't mean that we're always thinking about Jesus, but rather that there's a sense of the presence of Jesus. For example, if the Pope walked in the door at the moment, I'd be conscious of his presence, but I could still go on giving the talk. In other words, there's a sense in which there's a difference between stopping and thinking about Jesus, which we should do sometimes, but also the final goal is having that presence of Jesus that is there in our life. That's the goal. That's prayer with a capital P. That's the common life that we actually share with Jesus. The life of prayer is a life of virtue. There's an image that I like to use. It comes from the fathers of the church, that the Christian life is like an arch. And every arch has got two sides, and at the top you've got a keystone that keeps the sides of the arch up and stopping them from falling down. And he says that the keystone is prayer. Right? Without prayer, the whole thing collapses. But he makes the point that prayer's not going to stay up there by itself. The keystone needs the sides of the arch as well. And he suggests that the sides of the arch are really the transformation of our life, the practice of the virtues. And if we are going to have a life of prayer, then we need to have prayer as acts, but we also need the life of virtue as well. And she has an image there that I've put on the sheet. She says that if we try to go to God by contemplation alone, without the virtues, we'll end up a spiritual dwarf. In other words, you need both. You need individual acts of prayer, and you need the practice of the virtues as well. The foundations of prayer life we looked at last week, they were the virtues that she mentioned, the virtues of detachment, humility, and love for each other. So that's just making the point that I've just developed, that you need that context of the virtues alongside the particular acts of prayer that are there. There are some sheets down here at the front if you want to take them. Good. Yeah. The other thing that she mentions is that we need resolve and courage in our journey to God. That basically the journey to God is not an easy journey. It's one, it takes courage. We need to make a definite commitment to it. I think sometimes people can talk about their faith and it's just something that they have as a sort of a hobby. But no, it's got to be more than a hobby. It's got to be something we take very seriously, because if we are taking our life as disciples of Jesus seriously, then we need to do the things that are necessary to grow in that life. If we get sick, we naturally do all the things necessary to get well again. And I think it's the same in our journey to God. That if we are going to take it seriously, it takes great resolve and great commitment. She talks about a determined resolve, an earnest and most determined resolve to do it. And it does take courage because it's a way of life. I think one of the most important virtues of marriage must be courage, right? To actually sustain a common life over a long period of time with all the normal difficulties that can take place within it. There needs to be commitment, resolve, and it's the same with the life of prayer. She talks about the life of prayer, the goal of the life of prayer is service. When she reaches the seventh mansion, which in another book of hers talks about the highest stages that we can get to in this life, she said we go to prayer in order to get the strength to serve. That service is the final goal. And that's the issue in our faith. At the Last Supper, when the disciples were talking about who is the greatest, Jesus said to them, who is the greatest, the one who sits at table or the one who serves at table? And Jesus answered it himself. He says, it's the one that sits at table. But he adds, I have come to you as one who serves. And Teresa's making the point that the more we grow, the more we serve. I have a friend named Martha, and she always feels that Martha gets a bit of a bad deal, in the sense she's overshadowed by Mary. But the final reality is Martha, service. But of course, it's a service that comes out of being a Mary. That Mary is the relationship with Jesus that we're talking about. So Martha and Mary are really part of the one bundle, two sides of the one coin. That there is that relationship with Jesus that Mary symbolizes. But Martha is symbolizing the service dimension, which, as Teresa is saying here, is really the final goal of the life of prayer. So that's part of every Christian life. Now, some people devote themselves in a special way to that particular aspect, just as other people focus on other parts. But we cannot ignore the fact that service is the final reality. The next point that I wanted to make there is that prayerful acts take place within the life of prayer. And that means that whatever individual acts you do, their meaning really comes from the relationship. In other words, the thing about prayer is that it comes from the heart. St. Teresa on one occasion says, we've got mental prayer and vocal prayer, but she says it comes from the heart. It's not prayer unless it is the heart reaching out to the Lord. So our individual acts of prayer, it's not a question of saying, got to be expert at this bit or expert at that. No, it's having a heart so that whatever exercise of prayer we might use, our heart, our love is coming through in that particular act of prayer. So it's important to realize that whatever we do, as long as it's coming from the heart, then it is a prayer, because it's an expression of that relationship that we have with the Lord. Next week we're going to talk about the Lord's Prayer and her commentary on the Lord's Prayer. But she says you can go all the way with the Lord's Prayer. But, she said she knew one of her sisters who that was her way of praying, and she came to be quite a significant person within the community. And the last point that I wanted to make is that she talks about the power of the life of prayer. We don't often make the point, but Teresa lived during the Reformation in the 16th century. Spain was not involved as much in a lot of the things that went on in the rest of Europe, probably because they had the Inquisition, and Teresa herself, her books were often read by the Inquisition. Sometimes people object to Teresa when she says things like, well, I'm only a woman, I can't be expected to do this. But really, that was a good way of getting around the Inquisition. That if you did have something wrong, you could say, oh, well, it was just a mistake. So she was very shrewd. But the point I want to make is that she lived during the Reformation and quite consciously saw what she was doing as being a contribution to the church in the face of this very difficult situation. And even the founding of her little community at St. Joseph's, which was her first reform community, she mentions that was an effort to be part of that Reformation that was going on, not in terms of being there, but at least in terms of making a contribution to it. So they're the points that I just wanted to make about the second part of the book. Most of the texts that you find in the sheets will come from that second part of the book. Not all, but most of them. And what I would like to do now is really to take up something that comes from her autobiography. You may not be aware, but Teresa wrote an autobiography, which is one of the great autobiographies of the Church. It stands alongside the autobiography of St. Augustine of Hippo. And many people have come to the faith simply through reading her autobiography. So the result is that it's a very important work. Now, she was finishing the autobiography as she wrote The Way of Perfection. She had done a draft of the life, her autobiography, and it was suggested to her that she write a simpler book, which was The Way of Perfection. But within her life, she uses an image of watering a garden. And she talks about the soul, the life of prayer, as like having a garden in which the Lord comes and wanders about and enjoys. And she makes the point that if you're going to water a garden, there are a variety of ways that you can do it. And the first way is you let the bucket down and you put it up yourself. And that's the hardest way. But then there's also a way we can do it where you can have a wheel and you wheel it up, and that makes it a bit easier. And then the third way is that if you've got a creek nearby, you can irrigate it and the water comes more easily. And the fourth way of watering, of course, is the rain. So those four ways she mentions there. Now, the first water, which I want to talk about now, is really describing the whole of the journey which most people will travel. The second, third and fourth really talk about more advanced stages of prayer, and I don't wish to exclude you from that. But I wanted to focus on the first, and while she uses languages like beginner, beginner in the spiritual life is until you get to a stage when God actually intervenes and takes over. So you are quite a mature person even when you are at the end stage of being a beginner. So I'm going to use the slides, and I hope that you can see them. As I mentioned, the paperwork here is on the website as well, so you can follow it from there. I'll just have to adjust to that. I'll read through some of the things. I may not do them all. But the first point she makes is that those who enter into prayer are entering in to a relationship of love. And we've talked about the fact that it's companionship, it's a relation, and that's essential to her way of praying. It's an initial commitment to love God. That's what we're doing, entering into a love relationship. And I mentioned it's like a common life. As people in marriage lead a common life, so that is what we have here. One of the things that is central to her is that we need to be detached. And that was one of the three things that she mentioned. We talked about last week as necessary for the context. And she makes the point that our lack of desire, in other words, we want it. Where there's a will, there's a way. St. Thomas was asked on one occasion, how do we get to God? And he says, first of all, you must want it. Secondly, you must still want it. And thirdly, you must continue to want it. So really, it's the desire that enables us to go on. And what desire is an expression of love. That if you love something and you have it, well, that's joy. But if you love something and you have not yet quite got it in the way you want it, then you desire it. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about desiring Jesus. We do have Jesus in our life, but we don't have him yet in that final way when the life we share now will blossom into glory. So she makes the point there that desire is important. She suggests that often we're very niggardly, that's her word, and slow in giving ourselves to the Lord. And perhaps that's true. She says that what we often do is we give the Lord the interest, as it were, or the fruit, but we don't give the ownership. Right? We don't give ourselves, and that's what she's asking for. That we often want things, we expect lots of love from God, but keep our affections for ourselves. And I think that's just our nature Remember that our nature through sin now has its default our selfishness. It was meant to have as a default God. It was meant to take us to God. But through sin, it's actually got a new default, which is a self-centeredness that makes it difficult for the things that we're doing. So really what the early stages of prayer is about is it's laborious. It's difficulty. It's controlling the thoughts and emotions of our heart. I mentioned that the recollection is simply turning within and being with the Lord. But I think we all recognise that that's all very well to say it. But when we do that, all sorts of things come in as well. And really, our development of prayer is working with that to become more attentive to the Lord. I think it's important to emphasise that struggle that we have is a very natural struggle and is to be accepted. Sometimes people say, well, I went to prayer for 10 minutes and I prayed for 3 minutes and then was distracted, prayed for a minute at the end, so I did 4 minutes of prayer. Well, no, the person did 10 minutes of prayer. Our prayer is only interrupted when we consciously change what we were there for. Right? It's natural to drift off, but if we keep coming back, then we haven't really turned off our prayer, as it were. We are still praying. So we've got there about the water. I've already explained that, so I won't go through it again. But she's making the point that that we do the labour in the beginning. Because in the early stages, we're the ones that do it. At a later stage, when we get to the second and third water, God intervenes. People sort of say, well, how do I get there? You don't get there. That's something that God does. And God doesn't do that for everybody. It doesn't mean that because God doesn't do that you're not saved or that you're not loved by God. It's what is in your heart that is the important thing. And that's the thing that Teresa continually emphasises. She talks about working with the understanding, which is the point that I've made. And she makes the point that the Lord is pleased that we let down the bucket. Right? He gives the water. But sometimes there's no water in the bucket when we pull it up. But the Lord recognises the importance of us lowering the bucket and that we are making an effort. And while there may not be consolations that come, that isn't essential. She's going to say a bit later, I'll jump to another slide. Actually, I'm not doing the slides, am I? Terrible about that. Let me catch up. I think that's where I was. I'm just saying the Lord is pleased with our effort to water the garden, and he looks after the flowers, which are the virtues. But the point I think he's making is that whatever we do is contributing to that final reality of bringing about our relationship with the Lord. I won't jump ahead, I'll stick to the slides. The next slide there is talking about the preparation that she talks about. She talks about reflecting on our life. I don't think we should exaggerate that, but certainly it's good for us to look back and acknowledge who we are. I think that she sees that as being something that's important. But in the midst of that, we need to meditate and reflect on the life of Jesus. Reflecting on the passion of Jesus has always been a very central part of that initial stage of the journey to God. And it's obvious from what we've said already that we have a common life with Jesus, and it's in his passion particularly that we identify with Jesus. So that's important. There's a quote there from The Cloud of Unknowing, which is another very famous book, which we could read on another occasion. But it says, anyone who expects to advance without having meditated often on his own sinfulness, the passion of Christ, and the kindness, goodness, and dignity of God will most certainly go astray and fail in his purpose. So I think that captures what Teresa is talking about. The next slide is also from the Cloud of Unknowing. I won't develop it, but it's making the point that there is toil. It's a difficult journey to stick at it. And it's that patience sticking at it is the thing that helps us to grow. Just to take up something that the author of The Cloud of Unknowing makes a point of, You see, there's no shortcuts. There's no techniques that can get you to jump ahead. I have always been interested in prayer, and any time I hear of somebody that's got a shortcut, I always go along and listen to what they've got to say. So I've been along to Eastern meditations, I've been along to hypnosis and all those things. And all those things can do good things. They can quieten the heart, and a lot of people's life can be changed when they relax through using those sorts of things. But they're not bringing us to that common life with Jesus, right? Now, they might help in some way, but what we're talking about here is that common life with Jesus, and the traditional way of prayer is the way to do that. And that's what the author was saying there in the previous slide, that we have to read and reflect. And obviously we're reflecting on the Gospels. St. Jerome had that famous saying, ignorant of the Scriptures is ignorance of Christ. But how do we know about Christ? Well, we only know about Christ through the Scriptures. And while the Church keeps us in touch, the Scriptures are God himself actually reaching out to us. The point I wanted to jump ahead to is the next one, namely to embrace the cross. In other words, when we go to prayer, don't go to get, go to give. I think sometimes people look for consolations in prayer, and it's good. Consolations do come sometimes in prayer. But if we go to look for consolations, we will often be disappointed. But if we go to give, we can always do that. In other words, we're more likely to keep going in giving than if we go just in order to receive. So she makes the point, you can always give, you don't always feel that you have received, even though obviously you do always receive, but you may not be conscious of exactly what this is. So when the understanding ceases to work, people cannot bear it perhaps. Even then the wheel is increasing in power. What happens as we grow in our reflection on the Gospels, our understanding, our thinking tends to quieten. There's a good maxim in prayer from one of the saints where he says that pray as you can and give in to simplification. In other words, do what you can. Do the things in which you find the Lord, but give in to the simpler things. That if talking isn't something you do at the time, then just give in to that. Another one of our famous writers said that do the things that bring you to the Lord. Don't try to do things that don't. If I was to stand here and give you a whole lot of things to go home and do, well, you might do them for the first week, but after that, a lot of you would fall away. In other words, it's the things that take you to the Lord that you want to develop, and of course they then take you to a deeper experience and a different understanding of the Lord. So I think the last point there, the seeker of spiritual freedom should begin by not being afraid of the cross. The next point that's there on the slide is about humility, and I don't think we need to develop it. We saw last week that this was one of the three virtues that she considers to be essential. So that we recognise God's greatness. Pride is the principal opposition to this relationship. I think that's true in any relationship because pride is self-seeking, the very opposite of love. And I think in marriage, for example, unless we can rise above self-seeking, it's difficult for the relationship to endure. I wanted to emphasise the last point there, that humility is being ready to accept what the Lord calls us to. I think we might all like to be different. We might like to have had this or that in our life. But humility is accepting what the Lord has called us to be and what the Lord has given us. And it's in the acceptance of that that we really can be considered to be humble. So she does have a lot to say on that, but we've already looked at that before. So the next point that she makes there is the fact that while she's writing this book, she is actually having some experiences herself. We've got to realise that she wrote this book when she was about 42 or 43. She entered the convent at 21, and she acknowledges that for the first 20 years she lived in a very lax convent, which didn't have any of the restrictions that we might associate with convents today. And there was very little mortification there. And it was only at a later stage, just a couple of years before she wrote this book, that she actually began to enter seriously into the life of prayer and receive some of the experiences that she actually had. She says there that these experiences are preparing her for the trials that are to come. The next point there about the great men, and she of course had many great men talking to her, but the point she makes is that often these great men feel that they didn't have the sort of experiences that she was having. And why didn't they have it? Well, she says the reason is that they complain about it. In other words, that it's not a question of wanting that. You've really got to do it. So the lack of consolations can extend beyond beginners. She makes that point. We may not get to the second stage today, but in that second stage, the transition to the second stage is quite a difficult one. We give it the name of the dark night. In other words, it's not just suddenly there's all light and flowers all bloom. No, there's a sense of aridity, a sense of dryness that comes, and they're the signs that perhaps we're ready to go on. So being not having consolations doesn't necessarily mean you've turned into being a sinner, but it may be that it's time for you to move. Note that the Lord wants the determination to go on. She's going to make a point, and it's on a later slide, about the fact that many people get this far. Many people get to the end of this first stage. But she says few go on. So it gets tougher there, and few won't continue to make the sacrifices that are necessary for it to happen. I mentioned that they're the overgrown path. The Lord wants determination to go on. That's from another author, from the Abbé de Tourville. And he likens the Christian perfection to going along an overgrown path. And as you go along, the branches are coming back, and after a while you're not sure how far you've come, you're not sure how far you've got to go, and you're not sure where you are, but you want to go on. And that's Teresa's thing, that you want to go on. And that's what she's talking about at this stage, that determination to actually go on. So she makes some dangers there, that we need to sort of be ready to read things. One must never be depressed or afflicted because of aridities or unrest or a distraction of mind. These are fairly normal things. You'd be quite an amazing person if these things didn't ever occur. But the point that she's making is that we just then turn our heart back to the Lord. So if you go to Mass to pray for half an hour, and your mind may wander for quite a bit within that, but as long as you call it back, you really are still in that mode of prayer, if I can put it that way. She then goes on to talk about some temptations. Before we do that, she says that we have the normal help of grace to bring us through. And I think that's important. The next point she makes there is, don't try to advance by your own efforts, for you only will go back. And she makes the point that people wanting great things before the Lord gives them, that doesn't help, right? But really, the important thing is to be happy for the way that God has called you, and to give into that. And that is the way, really, to grow. She talks about making venerations and always strive for this precious companionship, and thanks the Lord for the desire to please him, even if our deeds seem of little worth. You need to, Teresa mentioned in this book and in The Way of Perfection, that at one stage in her life, in that 20 years when she hadn't really taken up prayer seriously, she used to talk a lot about prayer, but her life didn't reflect it. And she makes the point that the people she spoke to always took up her life rather than what she said about prayer. In other words, we have to practice what we preach. Then Francis of Assisi on one occasion said, or is alleged to have said on one occasion, that if you are walking to pray, to preach, let your walking be the preaching. So she wasn't doing that at an early stage. But I think then she's got a number of temptations that come to people in the journey to God, and they're worth considering as well. The first one there is that that one should relax. When one feels that everything is going well, there can be a tendency to relax. And the result of that can be too great. She makes the point, in the early stages, one should strive to feel happy and free. In other words, there can be relaxation, but it's not meant to be a relaxing of the journey to God. The reference to Abbot John there is not from Teresa, it's from a man named John Cassian in the 4th century. And there was a famous Abbot John who was a great master of prayer. And one day he was sitting by the roadside stroking a little partridge that was there, and the hunter came along. And the hunter was always a baddie in the monks' stories, and he was carrying a bow. And he criticised Abbot John for relaxing and just sitting there. Why wasn't he in his cell praying? And Abbot John asked him what he was carrying. He said he was carrying his bow. And John pointed out that you didn't have the connection. The string is not connected. And the hunter said, well, if I do that, the wood just loses its tension, and as a result, it won't work as a bow. And John drew the conclusion that it's like the life of prayer. We do need to have relaxation, and that's an important thing. But it's not a relaxation that takes us off the journey. And I think the point that Teresa's making there is that. There's another thing she says, don't allow self-confidence to lead one into the occasions of sin. In other words, we think we're doing well, therefore we can handle it. The reference to Alypius there is from St. Augustine's Confession. Alypius was a good friend of Augustine, and he had this affliction, or he was infected with the games. And he decided at one time he had to stop this. So he just stopped it through willpower. And later on, when he was in another city, his friends invited him to the games. He said, oh no, I'm not going to go to the games. And they said, well, we'll pick you up and we'll take you there. And he said, oh, won't make a difference, I'll just sit there with my eyes closed. So he went in with his eyes closed, but of course as soon as the crowd roared, he opened his eyes and was afflicted with the games again. In other words, he had confidence in himself. And I think the point being made is that humility that Teresa talks about, that we need to acknowledge who we are and that it is the Lord that is this. The second point that she makes there is a lack of confidence that we will reach the goal. And really, we should have a confidence in the Lord. That it's that desire that is the thing. That if we have the desire to be with the Lord, then that's going to help us to be able to go on. The next one there is one we've already talked about. Oh, I haven't been doing that. That's the one there. The third one now, I can't do it alone. That's pride, to make us think, well, you know, I've grown up now, I can handle this thing alone. No, that it's pride, and really we can't do it alone. You must always keep that humility before us. Without me, you can do nothing, says the Lord, and I think that's something that we need to bear in mind. The fourth point there is a false understanding of humility. She had a very difficult time at an earlier stage that she stopped praying because she felt she wasn't worthy to pray. And of course that was a false understanding of humility. And I think the point that she's making here is that pride can make us do all sorts of things and want to do things that are not going really to help us. But that humility that she keeps referring to is something that really is important. Another thing that she comments on, and I think it's a very human experience, that when you grow in your relationship with the Lord, you tend to think that everybody should be the same. You know, I'm sure you've all met people that have got religion, as it were, and they want to reach out and share with everybody, and not everybody might be at the stage that they want to be at. There's a good maxim, it's not from St. Teresa, I made it up myself, but the teaching is in Teresa, that when it comes to the spiritual lives of others, mind your own business. In other words, unless you are the person that has the responsibility. St. Teresa of Lisieux writes in her works that she sometimes saw sisters in the community that did something that needed correction. And she said to herself, I'm glad they're not novices. Because she was a novice mistress and she would have had to do something about it. So there are people who have responsibility, but I think we can very easily fall into judging others, and that's not something that we can do. I mentioned already the fact that many of the people that she advised, they imitated her poor behaviour rather than what she was saying about prayer. The other thing there is the distress and caused by the sins and failing of others. I think that flow over from the previous one. I think as we come closer to the Lord, we become more conscious of what's involved in our journey to God. And I think we see more clearly the things around us that really are not in keeping with a life that is worthy of the Lord. I don't mean that we judge people, but I think we realise that in our own life even, but also in the lives around us, that people can live in a way that really is in keeping with being a disciple of Jesus, and often they may not recognise that is the case. So I think it's important to realise that can be a temptation to want everybody to be having that same sort of commitment that you have. We've got a couple more slides there that I wasn't intending to do, but we've got a few minutes. She talks about spiritual directors. That's in the news at the moment, spiritual directors. She says that beginners need counsel. Remember what I said about beginners. It's not just people doing their first day of prayer. Beginners is that initial stage of life which all would have to pass through to come to a deeper maturity in prayer. And she suggests that that's helped. She has a lot to say about directors in her autobiography, not mainly, but often bad things, in the sense of people who gave her bad advice, particularly in that 20 years when she wasn't living a very committed life, and a lot of the things that she looks back on and see were not appropriate. Spiritual directors said they were appropriate, and so she looks back and sort of says she wasn't well advised. She talks about the importance of self-knowledge and the danger of inexperienced directors and those who cannot understand spiritually. I feel that our spiritual tradition is very much neglected in our church. I won't say that nobody does it or anything. The Pope's often quoting people, but getting down to actually reading things like Teresa, that hasn't actually been very central in our tradition. We haven't done that even with the scriptures, right? That most people would have the books of the scriptures that they wouldn't even know were there, and yet that's very at the heart of our faith. So to have a director, we need somebody, and she gives those three things there. He should be a prudent man of sound understanding. I think that's a pretty obvious sort of thing. The second thing is that he should be experienced. I think what she means by experience there is experience in living the journey. It's not just a question of being experienced in being a director. No, it's an experience. You want somebody that has travelled the journey. If you look back at our tradition, who did people go to? Spiritual directors. They chose people that obviously were renowned because they were holy and spiritual people. And I think that's the point that she's making. Now she says learning can be important, but she says the first two are the key, but learning has a role. And what she has to say about learning is, well, you can always consult a learned person. You know, if something crops up that needs special attention, you can sort of look to a learned person. But I think that's important. So you can see that she's saying that direction is important. I have a few comments about directions today. I think that it can be helpful to people, that people have got to want to do it. There's a bit of a movement in the church these days that everybody's got to have a spiritual director. People have gone to God for a long time without actually having spiritual direction. And I think what we need is more spiritual leadership. I mean, in a sense, leadership in a parish. Let's take this parish, for example. What we're doing here is spiritual leadership. In other words, it's been arranged that somebody can come and talk about the journey to God. And there are other things that you do. So what is important, I think, is spiritual leaders who do a whole lot of things. Now, individual spiritual direction can be one of those things that people do. But I think modern means of spiritual direction are often modern, and really in our tradition, there's a variety of ways that we can relate to people who can influence us and help us in the journey to God. So directors can be important, and she's right in saying that at times we do need help. If you do retreats and things, often it's good to talk to the retreat master or on a given occasions. And sometimes it's good just to have one talk with somebody just to sort of check out whether you are heading in the right direction. The next slide there is about the prayer of quiet. We're getting here into a quite advanced stage, and I don't want to dwell on it. She talks about this as a time when the Lord begins to sort of intervene somewhat in life. And the point that I want to make there is that there's less labour and more water. We're heading in the direction of the second water when we come to the prayer of quiet. The water is higher, grace reveals itself more clearly. The state of recollection, that sense of the presence of the Lord, she says it's almost supernatural. In other words, it takes place. It isn't yet the Lord intervening in the way that can happen at a later stage. But I think that as you grow, what we're trying to achieve is living in the presence of the Lord, right? And the presence of the Lord is not just thinking about the Lord, as I said earlier. It's a sense of presence. You could have somebody here and you're sensing that they're there, but it doesn't stop you from doing the things that you need to do. So that as we grow, I think that sense of the Lord's presence can be there even when we are engaged. Sometimes our engagement is so demanding we may not be aware of it, but it can be there in a common way. So the movement is from within. She talks about the various faculties, and I don't want to go into that, but nevertheless, she's talking about the fact that it's heading in the direction of that next water. I just wanted to talk a minute about the effects she talks about. It is a moment in which the person changes their life. When I say changes, I mean they begin to see things a little bit differently. She makes a few points there. Consolation and peace can come. The blessing and favours of the state foster the growth of the virtues. People become more conscious of things that are necessary. I mentioned that the arch, prayer, and the practice of the virtues. I think most people agree that prayer is important. Practice of the virtues often is slower to grow in the lives of people, but I think it grows particularly. Mortification becomes there. The soul begins to lose its covetousness of the things of the earth. In other words, to use her earlier language, we become more detached. That was one of the three things that you said was important. And remember, the detachment needs to be the result of attachment. So that as we become more attached to the Lord, as the Lord becomes more important in our life, then the things that we have and the attitudes that we have are less important. And you can probably look back on your own life and see the things that in the past you might have thought about, but that gradually you've come to realise that those things didn't deserve the place that you might have given them at the time. The soul does not need messages. I think that's spelt wrong. No. Thoughts, words, and things like that. In other words, there's a sort of an ability to be with the Lord. I think one of the things about today is people want to come to a stillness in prayer. Now, some of those things I mentioned, the hypnosis and Eastern things, they can bring you to a stillness. But the stillness that we're talking about is the stillness of a maturity relationship. The people who've been married for 50 years may not talk as much as they did in the first year of their marriage, but there's plenty of communication goes on between them. So that the stillness there and the lack of words and things like that, they are no longer as necessary as they might have been in the past. And I think that's what's happening here. God is beginning a new work in the soul. Soul seems to find everything at once, yet not to know what it's found. I think somebody wrote, and I think it might have been Teresa, that you feel as if you've lost your way, as it were. You know, that things are sort of different to the way they were before. You're quite confident that you're going ahead, but really it's not as clear as you think it might be. The other thing there, it comes on, is to the next stage, the second watering. I don't really want to go into that, but it's a new life in the garden. Those without experience in prayer will find it difficult to understand. And as she says, you don't know what to do. In other words, the things that you used to do are not the things that you do now. In the earlier stages of prayer, we make a great use of our understanding. And the purpose of that is to bring our will to make affections, to express our love for God. In other words, our faculties are working in the normal way. What happens in the next stage is that they don't work in the normal way. Sometimes people say, well, the intellect doesn't have a place, and sometimes in the Eastern Church, Eastern religions, they're trying to put down the intellect. Well, the intellect does have a place, but it doesn't do the same thing as it has been doing. In other words, it becomes more the recipient of God's grace and of God's knowledge and information, rather than doing it itself, as it were. So that what's happening here is that you're having to learn to do new things. And I don't want to say that nobody comes to here. It sounds very advanced. But she makes the point, and I'm not sure that she has it there, it might be on the next slide, that not a lot of people can get this far, but they may not go further. This is a sort of the threshold of the next stage. And it takes, I think after that prayer of quiet that you spoke about, there's a call there to do more. And some people aren't comfortable with the doing more. She's saying there, it feels so good, she doesn't want to move, the will is not complete. All of those are sort of individual things. But I think what's happening is that the relationship is deepening to the extent that we are becoming more conscious of the presence of the Lord. And really, if you want to know how successful you are in prayer, you need to look at your life. Not a question of looking at how you're praying here or how you're praying there. That the purpose of individual actual prayer is that common life that we have with Jesus. Well, that's all that I wanted to say. Could I suggest we just have a few minutes to talk, and if we've got any questions, we can respond to them, okay? Let's just talk for a minute. Would anybody like to make a comment or a question? It's not obligatory. Okay, well, if it's not, we'll meet again next week, and we're going to talk about her commentary on the Lord's Prayer. And as we've said already, the Lord's Prayer is very central to her. And next week, just as this week we did the second part of The Way of Perfection, and we did something from her autobiography, next week we'll do the third part of The Way of Perfection, but we'll say something from her Interior Castle, which is the final work, that's the most mature work. We won't do the whole thing, but we might just look at the first three mansions, which is the first water, as we've looked at it today. Okay? Thank you for your presence.